In drafting the translation itself, putting the actual words on paper, I would say there are 3 key steps. One is to get the basics, such as page numbers, formatting, fonts, etc., designated and designed so you can simply concentrate on your translating. Here, with my example, I've decided that I would use a certain fancy font. I have to add the page numbers. The formatting is just standard Word file format. Those are already in place. And then the second stage would be to get ready to be creative and focused. For the first draft, be ready to be a writer more than anything else. Don't stop. Keep going. When you encounter a hurdle, enter the Chinese, add your question, comments, and or alternative translations. Come back to these later, though, during the review and editing stages. I usually wait on translating the title and the name of the translator last. That's because the translation itself will actually inform you, the translator, on what the sutra title would best be. With the translator's name, I also like to do a little research about the translator before actually writing it down. But these are the final touches on the initial draft translation. The main part of the work is the translating of the sutra prose, and if there are verses, the verses themselves. With every Buddhist sutra, it begins with Ru Shi Wo Wen, and I just translate it as thus I have heard. This would be Ananda on behalf of the Buddha and what he heard from the Buddha, and basically making a claim that these are the words of Shakyamuni Buddha, and that Ananda, the I here, was one who heard it and hereby reporting it to everyone, or at the time, reporting it to the compilation of the entire Tripitaka, the 3 baskets of sutras, the commentaries, and the precepts, the guides on moral and ethical conduct. So whenever there is a term that you come across that you're not sure how you would translate, I usually keep a note, a list of the different terms that I will need to do more research on. So here, for example, the first word here is Wang Shechen. I am pretty sure it's Rajagriha, but I will want to double check. Then the name of the mountain. This is likely in Sanskrit, so I will probably look that up. I won't go over individual word translations at this point. Maybe that's something we can discuss at a future point. But at the draft translation stage, it's about you getting the words out, letting it just come forth, instead of taking too much of a critical eye to your translation. That's why, even though I have some different individual terms highlighted or indicated, I won't delve into them, the rationale or the decision yet. Kumarajiva's translation is indeed very consistent, very clear and succinct. Seems easier to translate. Everything is pretty straightforward and just following along. The draft translation of this sutra in one fascicle, one roll, 一卷, took about 3 hours. It's from beginning to end without stopping. Wherever there is a question, comment, alternative meaning, I put them down as such. This was a real pleasure to translate because of the wonderful translation that's extant in Chinese by Tripitaka Master Kumarajiva. Other sutras, commentaries, and precepts may not be so easy to translate or as swift, depending on the material. I put in the Chinese next to the estimate English translation side by side, and then later I'll compile a list that I then go back to fill in or amend the translation. That's the third step here in drafting the translation, is that you might as well highlight or compile a list of terms, phrases, or sentences even that you know that you will want to take a second look, to double check, to research, and or add to a glossary or index for this translation. Again, come back and review and edit at a later stage. Because this is a stage where you are kind of like a writer, you are brainstorming in some sense. So for example, here, when we come to this line where 四无量义菩萨白佛言，世尊法相如是甚深，菩萨当云何修行？法相 here could be translated at least a couple of different ways. And so because I thought of them, I wrote them down, and I put down Dharma features / forms, 法相. And I will come back these to anywhere where there are slashes and decide which alternative may be the best later on after doing the research, doing the reviews, sometimes doing the editing, and then deciding one way or another a particular term, phrase, and sometimes maybe an entire sentence. You may want to develop an entire way of indicating to yourself how you have these various alternatives. So for example, if it's just alternative terms, one word or two words, I use a single slash. But if it's an entire sentence or a couple of sentences, that's unusual, but sometimes I would put double slashes before or at the end of them, so that way when I go back it would be easier to note that those are two different alternatives or more to a sentence. There are maybe different ways you want to indicate to yourself the alternatives or the way that you're brainstorming. If I come to a place where I have a question or a comment, I may use the insert comment tool to write a note to myself. Highlighting is another effective way of making a note. For example, here when we're looking at 九地见转轮圣王百千大臣刹利居士而自围绕. This particular line I have the English highlighted because I would want to rewrite or adjust this sentence, so I'm pretty sure of it. That's why I made a highlight of it. I don't have a ready example to show here, but sometimes I copy and paste the entire Chinese paragraph and place the duplicate under the original Chinese. So that way I will go over the duplicate Chinese, replace certain parts of it in English. I usually am keeping certain words, phrases, or numbers in the original Chinese for me to come back and revisit later. That's why I copy and paste the whole thing, so I don't have to copy and paste each little thing each time. It's also easier not to miss anything that way. Some people think about using Google Translation, and I have tried that before. But because Google Translate and other similar translation tools aren't very familiar with Buddhist terms, the translation that they offer are very strange and actually becomes more time consuming to then rewrite the translation. They may be more suitable for secular translation where the words are more common. But with Buddhist text translation, especially where there are more difficult terms, unusual terms, then I'm finding, at least lately, that it's easier just to do the initial draft myself. But you may try Google Translate as a draft and then go back through and make changes to your satisfaction. But again, I think that loses a little bit of kind of the writer effect, where you are really just trying to translate from the guidance within. here you already have kind of a hard machine initial draft translation set out for you. Creativity and the whole flow is a little difficult to come by. In fact, my preference here would have been to handwrite the translation here instead of doing it here all in Word file electronically. I'm sure it may not be so easy on your eyes. I sped up the last couple bits of the video to about 20 times, and just so that you could see at least the entire rundown. But no worries if you're not able to catch every detail. It's not the point here anyway. But where there may be more creativity and kind of your hand connected to heart type of translation, maybe through handwritten pen on paper, pencil on paper type of work. If people still do that, it works better for me sometimes. But here, just for the purpose of screen sharing, I use the Word file to show you kind of in one sitting a translation. And of course, this is the initial draft. The next stage is the review stage, and at that point you'll see that there are a number of corrections and amendments that I will be making to the translation. As you work through the translation yourself, it's also a process of learning about the text. For example, when we are doing a translation, well, let's take this example where I'm translating the 10 paramitas. The 10 paramitas at the beginning, when I'm looking at the list, I don't have all of the Sanskrit terms in my head, but as I translate through the text itself actually explains the terms, including what the Sanskrit terms mean for the 10 paramitas. So I am able to, in the review stage, go back and insert or change the matched up paramitas. And this learning process happens in the drafting stage, and then in the review stage you really want to apply what you learn, and also further learning that you've gotten from other research places, and then insert them back here in the initial draft translation.